sad to see that the potential that radio could have to turn it around right now in the noisy world cluttered with the democratized internet, they're not doing it. It's like Broadway saying, well, we don't have to be the best theater in the world. People we're Broadway. You know, if you're going to go to Broadway and you're going to pay $1,000 for a ticket, it better be better than the community theater back in Peoria.
Sure.
And if you're going to go see a Major League Baseball game, I don't care how many Sandlots there are or Little League teams there are. You want to see Major League Baseball and you're going to pay money to see it. Well, the answer to the podcast question with radio is make the best damn audio entertainment and information in the world and put it on the radio like Broadway is on Broadway and the New York Yankees play at Yankee Stadium, and you'll have a successful medium.
Benztown president Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi.
Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
My next guest has worked at legendary stations from coast to coast, including NEW in New York, KMET here in Los Angeles, KPRI in San Diego, TIC in Hartford, and WCBS New York. And that is just a few, by the way. He's credited with creating the AOR format. He's hosted a myriad of syndicated shows. He was the first managing editor for R&R. He's also been a columnist for Billboard. He's been a station owner. He's a member of a rock band, no joke, and he created Talkers. When I started going through my guest, who I've not yet formally shared or introduced, I should say, I could not believe his resume. We actually kind of met through our mutual friend Mike McVeigh, and how we have not crossed paths between over the last 25 years I've been in the business still kind of blows me away. But I am so impressed with his career. Please welcome Michael Harrison. Michael, welcome to the show.
Chachi, what a nice introduction. I'm honored to be on your podcast and on your show, and getting to know you has been a real pleasure.
That's right. Thank you very much. And your career, and I want to kind of first start off with your childhood, but the stations, we'll get into more detail here in a couple minutes, you've worked for, just a list of who's who of radio stations and obviously syndication work, and you've worked at incredibly influential trade publications, and you own a very influential trade publication. But how did your interest in radio start growing up?
Well, I was a rocker. I was a top 40 rock and roll fan. I would say at the age of 5 or 6. I just loved hearing the radio playing in the background. And my sister is 8 years older than me. So when I was 9 years old, she was a bopper in the 50s. She was 16, 17 years old, and she took me with her wherever she went, to dances, on dates. The kids, her friends, would come over to the house. They actually would roll up the rug and play the songs on the little RCA record player that would, each one would fall down.
Oh, I love that, like a sock hop.
Yeah, I had my hands all over her record collection, her 45s, and so I was I was interested in a lot of things. I was kind of one of these kids that knew a little bit about everything. I was very interested in things, but I had an interest in radio and music deeper than the average kid. I used to listen to the countdowns in New York. I grew up in suburban New York and Long Island, and I'm from Brooklyn originally. And I used to listen to WMCA, WABC, WMGM, and a few other, and they all had their own countdowns. And I noticed, wait a second, they're not the same. And I started to try to figure out which ones were more accurate, and I kept my own lists. So I was doing it since I'm a kid.
That's amazing. So you took to music a very young age. Was your family, outside of your sister, were they into music or musical?
My family was a very dramatic family. They were very theatrical people, even though they weren't always in show business. For a brief period of time when I was a kid back in the 50s, my father dabbled in management. For a short period of time prior to him having the hit Hey Girl, my father managed Freddie Scott, and he used to come to the house and sing. And so I had some insights into show business through a very theatrical, flamboyant family.
And I assume they were supportive. being that they were in the business themselves?
They were very supportive and got a big kick out of my career because I was in radio at a very young age, and I was a host of a New York morning show at 22 or 23 years old.
Yeah, I want to get into that. And how did that, you grow up outside of market or in market number one? How do you get your first gig there? How did that happen?
Well, I got my first gig on Long Island, and Long Island is a suburb of market number one. And back in those days, suburban radio did not have much of a cachet in terms of the industry. The feeling was if you start on Long Island, before you can ever get to New York, you got to go through Kansas City.
Okay. So I didn't know that. So I kind of felt like Long Island's market 17 though. I mean, it's a major market.
Today, Long Island is, there are markets in the top 20 today that old timers would think are still small towns.
Interesting.
The old paradigm has changed. The whole map has changed. And yet I find a lot of the older folks still think of certain cities as being bigger than other cities, when in fact it's not true. There's been migration from the Rust Belt to the South. People go out west, look at Florida. I had mentioned to you when you were a guest on my podcast, when I wound up working in San Diego after having been in New York. This was in the mid 70s, I felt I got to get out of here. I got to get back to a major market. I was embarrassed that I went to San Diego because they let me do something that I wanted to do as a programmer. Right. But I never stopped and thought that this is a major place unto itself. So the whole thing with markets has changed, but I grew up on Long Island. I went to school on Long Island. I went to Hofstra, and I broke into radio on Long Island at a beautiful music station while I was still at Hofstra, while I was still in school. And it was a gig that basically had no cachet whatsoever other than I was on the radio. It was basically an FM station at a time when FM was not considered real radio. They weren't in cars. I was looking forward to the day when I'd get a job on an AM station with jingles, a real station. And, people would say, when are you going to get a job on a real station? And I wound up becoming program director of that station and turning it into a rock station. It was WLIR. I had a great, good fortune, along with my friend and colleague there, Richard Neer, who's still on the radio in New York. I became program director. He became music director. We installed a rock format. And 9 months later, we were in New York radio. It was the most successful thing I ever did. And that's how I catapulted from Long Island to New York. And one of the contributions I made to Long Island radio was that a lot of kids followed me in terms of Long Island suddenly being looked at seriously as a place that you can make a direct jump into a major market, and eventually it became a major market.
And let me clarify here, just to give a little more context. So this is LIR. You take it from a beautiful music station and you flip it to progressive rock. And this is in 1970. And was that before, I don't want to go to San Diego first, but was that one of the first progressive rock stations in the country at that point? One
of the first, not the first, but one of the first. Matter of fact, it was one of the first second generation progressive rock stations. There have subsequently been 10,000 generations. So that was right near the Big Bang. It wasn't exactly the Big Bang,
but early universe.
Universe. And I was very influenced by what was going on at WOR-FM, which switched over to WNEW-FM with Roscoe, Scott Muni, Allison Steele, Jonathan Schwartz, Pete Fornatel, and Zachary, that original cast. And we were on Long Island, and basically we were influenced by them. That's what gave me the idea that we should create such a station for what I called the Long Island culture. So that was what was going on. So when Roscoe left WNEW-FM, Roscoe did the night show, and he was the coolest guy in the world. African-American, came from jazz radio, and he had this voice that was like silk, and he would say, "Take a mind excursion, baby. This is Roscoe on Metro Media Stereo, WNEW-FM." And it was just this whole, the way it flowed out of the speakers. And I said, I can do that. And, because I wasn't very good at the top 40 thing. I wasn't very good at top 40, but this progressive thing gave theater students, and I was a theater student, an opportunity to play a different kind of a role in the culture. And when Roscoe left NEW, I got a job there. I filled the spot. He was on at night. I went on in the morning, and they shifted everybody around because in those days, night radio, 6 to 10 p.m. shift was considered the big shift, because that's when all the college kids were listening. And even in top 40 radio, if you think back, the really big famous jocks from the 60s and the 70s were on at night.
So you jump LAR, you have a tremendous amount of success there, and now you jump over to NEW. So now you are in market number one. I mean, what does that feel like? Are your parents just thrilled? Are you jumping up and down? What was the moment when you found out that you were getting this gig?
Richard and I both operated in tandem. We said to everybody, "You've got to take us as a team." We're not on the air together, but we were working together. And Allison Steele was very kind to us, and Pete Fornatel were kind to us, and they made the management there aware that there were these guys out on Long Island doing something that was pretty extraordinary. And they interviewed us, and lo and behold, they just called us in one day and said, "We got some openings. Would you like the jobs?" And the pay was like 5 times more. And but I learned very quickly that there's no fantasy land. I've learned that there's no magical place where stars live, that the MGM studios of Hollywood in the 30s was basically a facade, and that it was a factory, and that just because a radio station had this camaraderie among the DJs, and it had a shtick, and it had a thing, that it really was very different in reality. And that I learned that at NEW, because I remember when I first got the job there, Varner Paulson, who was the vice president and general manager of Metro Media, which owned the station then, and VP GMs, that was like, the colonel. That was a big position. He said to me, "Son, see these hallways? These hallways were once, walked by people like Jack Benny and Milton Berle, Dinah Shore." And he'd like, "Oh my God, I'm this small-time pisher from Long Island, and here I am in this situation." But the harshness of it, and all the stuff that goes on in a radio station that I later became not only savvy to, but kind of an expert on the sociology of radio stations, that hit me squarely. And I was off kilter the whole time I was there, because I didn't buy in to some of the philosophies that they operated under. And I was already doing something that would later be called AOR, the next iteration of album rock, that was a little more research oriented, a little bit more hit oriented, a little bit more controlled for the sake of getting ratings and getting listeners, while maintaining.
So were they not obviously big corporation, made New York City, NEW, massive radio station? Would you go to them and kind of explain some of your philosophies, and they just said, "Hey, shut up, kid," not listen to you? Or what was the, you not subscribing to their philosophies? Specifically, what didn't you like?
Well, I didn't like the fact that progressive radio was obsessed with not having playlists and not having formats and playing obscure music. And interesting. So they wanted to go kind of the antithesis of what you would think. They wanted to just let you kind of go off. There wasn't any real structure. Am I understanding that right? I found that to be destructive. I thought that there was a point at which progressive underground radio was playing to itself, and that it wasn't necessarily playing music that the audience wanted as much as what the jocks wanted.
That's that's the antithesis of what you would think a young person would say. You were, how old were you at that point?
22, 23. I was
mean,
not
you were wise.
Not a normal kid. Remember, I was doing record charts at 8 years old.
So what was this? Tell me though about that, the lack of structure. So you would go in to do your show and you could basically play whatever you wanted?
Yeah.
No kidding. And how would you devise your playlist?
But you were under tremendous pressure from your colleagues as to what you were playing. The diversity was not celebrated. They all emulated each other. And I was in the morning. I went off on a different path, and my numbers were extraordinary because I was focusing on quarter hour maintenance.
But there wouldn't be any. That is so foreign to me. There wouldn't be any guidance on what to play from the station, from the management of the station itself. You didn't have any sort of research. The
management hired me because I was doing so well in Long Island. They thought that we were magic hippies that had the answers to the culture. And we didn't know, when Richard and I were being invited into New York by ABC FM and they knew about us. We were making noise out there. We didn't know, should we wear our suits or should we wear our dirty old, Woodstock outfits? It was so unclear as to what they were looking for because they didn't know what they were looking for. But they did know that when the ratings came and the thing started making money, then the consultants came in, then things got a little tighter, but I was already gone.
Fascinating. So you were way ahead of your time then.
On a scary level.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote articles in Billboard magazine in 1981 predicting basically the whole computerized realm that radio and the music industry wound up, making its paradigm. And I've just always been, I still have to watch myself. So one of the things that I've learned over the years, and I don't want to sound boastful, but you're asking me questions. I'm answering you honestly. Yeah,
no, I appreciate. I want you to answer. Your career is incredibly impressive, and I just find it remarkably fascinating. So you basically say, look, there's not enough structure here. You're not ultimately implementing programming strategies that, as of today, we would find very common. You would not find a station, or if they do exist, they'd be very rare, where you could just go in and play whatever you wanted to play. And so they say, kid, you don't understand, and essentially show you the door, or you leave on your own.
They gave me the opportunity to leave on my own, but really was showing me the door. But they liked me and kept me around another year filling in. And, but the next day I was called by, the program director at, WCBS FM, who said, hey, you want to work here? I said, I've never done that kind of radio. And I said, but sure. And the day after that, I was called by the program director of WPIX FM, which was pure top 40. CBS FM was oldies, and NEW was progressive. And for about a year, I was on the air 6, 7, 8 times a week, sometimes on 2 stations back to back. I'd run across town in a cab while the news is on. and I was doing 3 formats.
The fly jock of New York City.
Yeah. During that time, what I learned was radio mechanics. I learned firsthand what it's like to do top 40 in New York, what it's like to do the CBS highly reverberating, CBS FM, that type of thing, and how to maintain my eye and ear on album rock. And I finally had an opportunity to go to a station in San Diego after that year. I was also teaching music at NYU. KPRI in San Diego was up against Ron Jacobs and KGB, which was doing a form of AOR. Jacobs' background was top 40, and he was doing album rock at KGB, and Billboard was writing stories about him like he was the second coming, in radio. And I went and had an opportunity to turn KPRI into an AOR station. I used the term AOR at that point, and I made it popular by getting involved with Radio and Records, which had just started at that time, and I became friends with publisher Bob Wilson. So I started to use that as a platform to discuss AOR. But my success at KPRI with against, and it was a real radio war, the great Ron Jacobs. All the time we had KCBQ and other great stations in that market. My success, coupled with my visibility in R&R, made AOR just be like wildfire. And it was a great period.
Let's talk about that jump. You decide to go to San Diego, and you mentioned earlier in the podcast that you were really anxious to get back because you kind of felt like San Diego at the time was a smaller market, which, you know, certainly everything is smaller than New York. You now, though, are given a canvas in a lot of ways to create. This is kind of I know you obviously at LIR, you I guess created progressive rock, or were one of the progressive rock stations, or first progressive rock stations. But now you've got a canvas to really develop and build your very own format.
Right. And I just want to reiterate that I do not take credit in any way, shape, or form for inventing progressive rock. I emulated the great ones that came before me, who had been doing it for a year and a half.
Yeah. Well, you were okay.
So we'll say it had 15 years, history, but
You were a founding father. You weren't the George Washington, but we'll call you Thomas.
I was not the George.
You're Thomas Jefferson of progressive rock. I'll say that.
And I also have to say, just so as not to be a total fool and arrogant, that even though I am the first person to use the term AOR and probably the most influential in the early stages of it, of having it taken seriously, there were others that were doing a more researched, thought out, strategic, positioned version of progressive rock. Lee Abrams was on the scene. You had Alan Shaw at ABC FM. There were other people, Rock and Stereo. There were other people who got wise to the idea that this thing to go forward has to be competitive, not just service the disc jockeys as a place for them to play what they like.
How long did it take you to build the format?
I would say it was first being built during my days at NEW in the morning. I was building it there, which got me into some trouble with them because they thought that I was too commercial.
Okay. So you're building it during your own morning show.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And,
I see.
And it did get ratings, which they did. They were not prepared for at Metro Media because they didn't expect mornings to have the highest ratings on the station.
So you've been crafting this for a while.
Yes.
You were just looking for the place to implement it.
Yes, and so I would say over the 2.5 years that I was in San Diego, and I think our ratings went from a 1.2 to a 4.3 or something like that, which is a huge jump in Arbitron.
That's a massive jump. Who were the owners of the station?
Southwest Broadcasters Incorporated, the Shattuck brothers. That was during the days when every town had many owners.
Okay.
KGB was owned by Mike Brown, who was a local Cadillac dealer. There were no Clear Channels or iHeart.
Right.
But, and a mega company would be a company that owned 7 stations.
Right.
That would be so
how did you convince them to what was the format before you got there?
It was progressive, underground, freeform, hippie radio.
Okay, got it. So it was much like what you were doing in New York.
They brought me in to make it more competitive because they were getting their asses kicked by Ron Jacobs, who was
understood. Okay, KGB. Okay, I'm sorry. That's all coming back. Okay, so you get in there, and did they know exactly what they were getting, or you just kind of showed up and did this gradually?
No, they wanted it. That's why I picked up and moved to San Diego after being a lifelong New Yorker, because it was an opportunity at a very low pay in a very, very far away, weird place that I didn't know a lot about. Okay. I'm a Long Island kid. It's the 70s. And I'm going to San Diego, because they let me do this format and encouraged it because they wanted to be successful. And it worked. Of course it works. If you take this body of music that's swirling out there that has captured the attention of a whole generation, and then you figure out what are the aspects of it that make it popular, and what are the aspects of it that are holding it back. And also one of the reasons I came up with the term AOR is because it sounded like MOR. There was no hot AC or AC back in those days. AC was called middle of the road, and the advertising agencies loved MOR stations because it was the sweet spot. It wasn't kids. It wasn't the elderly. It was right in that nice middle ground of adults. Because the adults then were not the same adults now. They're all dead now, but the 30 and 40-year-olds. And the problem that progressive rock radio had was the agencies didn't like it. They thought it was hippy dippy, acid rock, drug music, anti-war. It was politically, so I turned it into something that was more palatable from a sales perspective. I've always walked the line between the art and the commerce, and AOR was the result of that, and it worked.
Give me an example of let's say a 3 or 4 song segue of KPRI in 73, 74, 75.
You would hear the Doobie Brothers, Blackwater, Steve Miller, Jet Airliner, Paul McCartney and Wings, Helen Wheels, and then you'd hear something from earlier. We might go back so far as to play The Loving Spoonful and Summer in the City, and we were not shy about playing some top 40 songs that were musically interesting, like when Hunka Chaka came out.
I got a feeling.
I jumped on that. They go, that's not progressive. That's not AOR. Go, don't tell me what's AOR. I invented AOR. People, that's not, that's not thing. We're dealing with that now with the left and the right in talk radio and politics. Everything I learned back in those days has come full circle and exists today in talk radio. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But we played Stevie Wonder, Inner Visions. Living for the City was a big song that we would play. The Allman Brothers, Brothers and Sisters, when that came out, what a big album that was. I can go on and on.
That's awesome, man. Sounds fantastic. So you have pretty immediate success down there. What made you decide? And I should mention concurrently at this point, you're also now writing for R&R. You start as the AOR writer. Is that pretty much happening at the same time?
Yeah, totally. And my late wife, Sharon, put together the AOR section of R&R in our apartment in Point Loma in the San Diego market. The R&R became so successful that they asked me if I would like to come up to LA and be full-time managing editor. Actually, AOR editor, but that quickly became managing editor. I said, yeah, I'm coming. and I left KPRI the day that I got to LA. The day that I got there, I got a phone call from a fellow by the name of L. David Moorhead. L. David Moorhead was one of the princes of Metro Media. He was the vice president, general manager of KMET. And he knew about me from back in New York, my days at NEW, which were starting to become kind of my history, my cachet, because I'm developing a name in the business. Now I'm in LA and I'm at R&R and I'm not on the air. So he calls me up. He says, do you miss being on radio? And I said, I'm off radio for a day. He said, come on over. Let's have lunch. And he offered me the program directorship to turn KMET into a more modernized competitive rock station because KMET was getting its clock cleaned by Rock and Stereo at KLOS, the ABC station. And KLOS did research. KLOS did these sets. They did quarter-hour maintenance. They did all the things that you do to get ratings. And KMET was a wonderful station. They had great people there, but they were. They had that attitude that, we're not going to play anything that's on a playlist. And they were still in that mode.
Progressive rock, like they were back at NEW. Got it.
Exactly. And so, I said to Moorhead, now you offer me the program directorship. I have a commitment to Bob Wilson. I have a commitment to R&R. I can't do it. As a matter of fact, I don't even know if I could work with you because in those days, being the editor of a trade magazine, you're supposed to be completely unbiased and not have any connections to any station.
Journalistic integrity, right?
Yeah. That was kind of an idea that existed back then.
Yeah.
He said, then why can't you consult us? and do a little jock work for us and just help us get this library in shape. So, I did. A young woman who was in administration at KMET by the name of Sam Bellamy. She became the program director, and I sort of mentored her for almost a year. And quietly, I mean, people knew I was involved, but what I wanted in return was I wanted to do 1 day a week disc jockeying. But what I wanted on KMET, and this is where my world started to change, I was already fascinated by talk radio. And I was fascinated by a fellow by the name of Alex Bennett, who was doing a issues-oriented talk show on a New York top 40 rock station, WMCA. And he was political, he was outrageous, he was excellent in those days. He was a young fellow and he was breaking ground. I wanted to do that on I wanted to do a talk show on a rock station. And I said, I want to do a talk show. I want to do an issues-oriented talk show on the weekends. And they gave it to me. And that had developed into a thing called Harrison's Mic. I did that show on Saturday morning and Sunday night for over a decade. And,
that's unbelievable. And you didn't play any music, even though you're on a music station.
No music. Yeah, I played one song between hour 1, hour 2, so I can go to the bathroom because we didn't have music. I used
What kind of topics would you cover?
We talked a lot about relationships. We talked a lot about the legalization of marijuana.
You again, way ahead of your time, man.
I was. I mean, it's not my style. I feel very uncomfortable saying, yeah, I did this, I did that. I'm more used to putting the spotlight on other people. I often say I give awards, I don't get them. But I'm making an exception now because you seemed pretty vehemently interested.
Yeah, so impressive. Really quickly, back to R&R. When you studied at Hofstra, did you study journalism? Like, who taught you how to write and to start being the managing editor of R&R?
I was just a smart kid. I never studied journalism. I never studied communications. I studied theater. I was interested in that type of thing. And by the time I graduated Hofstra, I graduated as a secondary education major, meaning I was a licensed to be a high school teacher for English. I even, while I was still doing LAR as a rock station, I was student teaching to get my degree in Springfield Gardens High School in New York, teaching English 11. So I'm teaching English 11. I'm running a rock station.
It's unbelievable, the body of work. Really quick, what was the movie? We were just talking about this on your podcast, and I should have written this down, with Bradley Cooper. It just came out about a year or two ago, and he's wearing the KMET shirt.
Oh, Licorice Pizza.
Yeah, Licorice Pizza. Did that bring back memories?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, Licorice Pizza was the name of a big record store. I can't believe there are no more record stores. I mean, think about that as a cultural change. But back in the day, KMET rocked Los Angeles.
Yeah,
and they had the billboard with that famous KMET logo all over the place. And some places the billboard was upside down, so as to like show you this station is really out of the box. And I think
Darren, who you met earlier, who's helping produce the show over here, you listened to a lot of KMET, didn't you?
I would drive down from San Luis Obispo with my friends just to listen, because we couldn't get it up in San Luis Obispo. Right. But we'd heard about it, and Fraser Smith, I think Fraser was on it. I'm not sure if he was on KLOS at that time, but I think he started at KMET. We'd just come down to hear that station. Yeah, it was just known everywhere, even though we couldn't get it. So my friends and I, we'd hop in a car, we'd get a hotel, we'd all pitch in.
Are you serious? Just to listen to the station?
And listen to radio in Los Angeles, just because it was so good.
That's good. Amazing.
Yeah, KMET was probably the most exciting station I've ever worked at. And I have to take a little credit, not a lot. It was just one of those things, amazing people. Sam Bellamy went on to be a fabulous program director. The staff there was wonderful, and they ran that thing so well. All I really had to do for years was come in on the weekends, do the talk show, and play some music in addition to the talk show, a music show that I did separate from the talk show. It wasn't until maybe 8 years into it that the ratings started to slide. And the feeling at Metro Media was that it was out of control. And suddenly KLOS was back above it. K-Rock was above it. So they asked me if I would want to be the PD and pull it back together. I did, and the ratings came up. But of course, a lot of people felt that the Michael Harrison brand of KMET was a little too commercial for their tastes. And to this day, there are people that are mad at me. As a matter of fact, I have more people mad at me from that than anything else I've ever done. I'm pretty well liked in the business. But yeah, KMET was a sacred temple. And a lot of people think that back in the day, everybody got along beautifully. It was peace and love and harmony and kumbaya. Behind the scenes, some of the most vicious battles took place over the politics of what music to play and what the stationality of these stations was supposed to be. And we don't see that today because it's all so corporate. Nobody dare speak up about programming.
Who would be in a music meeting at KMET?
The music meetings were, when I was program director, the music meetings had three people: me, Sue Steinberg, who was the music director, and a fellow by the name of Rich Pambino, who was the promotions director. And back in those days, you'd get tons of contenders, tons of really important music would come out every week.
Right.
You'd have a Steely Dan album, a Fleetwood Mac album, and a Supertramp album, and a Doobie Brothers album, and a Paul McCartney album, and George Harrison would release an album. And it was, so you would do a lot of needle dropping. And there was some research, some sales. We looked at stuff like that, but it was basically the three of us in that era. Prior to that, I'm sure that Sam Bellamy ran the meetings with their various music directors over the years. And that basically wasn't to come up with a playlist that was as tight as today's playlists. It was basically to decide which songs were approved, which albums were approved or added, for the jocks then to do with as they would. And there was a lot of cheating going on too.
What do you mean cheating?
People would slip songs on the air that management
really?
didn't approve of when they didn't think they were listening. Back in those days, it went out into the ether and it's gone.
Gone, sure.
It was, I can't believe how different it is today. I'm certainly on top of the differences. I mean, I'm not a merchant of nostalgia. I still consider myself a forward-thinking futurist. I just happen to have a tremendous wealth of history that I can draw upon.
Before I jump, you going back to the East Coast and literally changing formats. Well, kind of changing formats. It's interesting about the night show that you were talking, or the weekend show where you did talk. But I want to note, you also were really active in syndication. You did a show for TM Productions. It was a 48-hour AOR show called Album Greats, A History of Album Rock. You did a syndicated show called The Great American Radio Show with Mike Harrison, and that went from 77 to 83 for Westwood One. That was an AOR weekly 2-hour countdown. I mean, you were staying really busy because you're, at this point, you're writing for R&R, you're consulting, you're doing nights, and you're doing a countdown show. Where did you find time for it all? And you also did another thing called Good Phone Weekly from 78 to 80. And then the Royalty of Rock, a celebration of Rock Empire from 80 and 82, an RKO Radio Network show. I mean, how did you find time for all of this?
I worked very hard. I still do. I worked long hours. And I'm also really kind of a bug on time management. I don't hang out. I don't waste time. I try to use every minute productively. And I also don't have a lot of patience for long committee meetings and for a lot of the things that takes up time. Make a decision and you do it. And I work between research and instinct. I think they have to be together. But I had a falling out at R&R with Bob Wilson circa 1978. I was very involved with the growth of R&R, the development of its charts, and the creation of its conventions. But he was the boss, and I was one of his lieutenants, and it was time for me to move on. So I started a trade publication called Good Phone. And the company is Good Phone Communications, which is still my company today, and started that in 78. And Good Phone was a kind of a futuristic tip sheet for album rock stations. And also, we were pioneers in what went on to be smooth jazz. I called the format Triple Z Jazz. I spelled it Jazzz with that extra buzz at the end. and we promoted that, and that became, cool, smooth jazz.
So you're entrepreneurial to boot. You start this business, and was this advertiser driven?
Oh, totally advertiser driven. Made a lot of money with it because the record companies, if they thought you had a radio audience, they'd throw advertising your way. And so, to make a long story short, I left R&R 78, started Good Phone, was publisher of Good Phone, was still doing the Great American Radio Show for Westwood One, producing album greats for TM. There were times when the Great American Radio Show was on one AOR station in a market and album greats was on the other.
Unbelievable.
And it's crazy stuff. I mean, it's a long time ago, Chachi. I mean,
but I mean, what a massive accomplishment. And you're also consulting or programming KMET at the time and doing nights there.
And then became the PD. So I was doing a lot of stuff. The Great American Radio Show with Mike Harrison, I believe, was the third show that Westwood One had in syndication. They had the Dr. Demento show, and I think they had a show before that called the 12 Days of Motown Christmas. And,
no kidding. What was that like, the early days of Westwood One and working with Norm?
I was working in a small company with Norm Pattiz. and Norm Pattiz called me up and said, "I'd like to have lunch with you." I go, "Okay." And he was, Norm Pattiz,
sure.
Larger than life. Well, he was not Norm Pattiz then. He was Norm Pattiz, some guy who was a TV salesman who wanted to start a radio syndication company that would change the paradigm of syndication from being cash-based, like American Top 40 with Watermark, to barter-based, with a whole bunch of pimple cream advertisers, and you get that he had a connection at Warner Lambert, an agency that specialized in Clearasil. I don't remember, pimple cream.
Right. Yeah.
And it worked. And he said
unbelievable.
to me,
I knew that he was obviously the forefather, and I owe a lot of, what we do today to him, but I didn't know that's how, I knew it started with Dr. Demento, but I didn't know he had this Warner Lambert connection. So they basically said, hey, if you create this content, get it distributed on radio stations, we'll buy airtime.
Absolutely. And he asked me if I would help with the production of rock shows, because I had that reputation as being, one of the main guys in the AOR field. And I said, sure. So we created a rock countdown with top tracks. I created a format called Top Tracks because my mantra was, why are we letting record company A&R departments program our stations? That by the time the third or fourth track on Fleetwood Mac's Rumors or Steve Miller or Doobie Brothers comes out, it's old for our audience. So I created charts called Top Tracks that were the relative popularity, and the word I used was potency, of songs from top albums, and they were completely out of sync with what the A&R departments at record companies were putting out as singles. You couldn't use that research in a formatted, research-based album rock station. So Good Phone Weekly promoted Top Tracks, and then when Billboard bought Good Phone Weekly from me in 1980, they wanted that Top Tracks chart. They stopped publishing Good Phone, and they took all of the research I was doing, the charts, some of the writers, and me as a editorialist. I didn't do Vox Jocks. No, I did, here's what's going on in our business, and here's what you should do. I did that for a couple of years, and the Top Tracks thing took hold, and that really took rock radio, rock FM album radio, to a higher level of being programmable and having its own research.
Absolutely wild. So you sell your company, Good Phone. I'm going to try to unpack this here for a second. You have it for 2 years. You build it up. Billboard comes to you and says, hey, we want to buy this from you. Mm-hmm. In Good Phone, you had developed Top Tracks, which was essentially helping programmers with what songs to play. How were you coming up with that research, by the way? Was that just via call out, or how would you know what songs to put in there and their potency?
The first one was the needle dropping.
Okay.
We, I've had a number of arguments with big time record executives over what the next single should be, because I've always considered the research to be, can I say this on this show, bullshit.
Sure.
I've always thought there was a tremendous degree of bullshit to research, not completely, but you couldn't totally believe in it. You had to have an ear. Do you go back far enough, Chachi, when they used to talk about people in the business as having an ear? Oh, that guy's got an ear.
Oh, yeah.
That was the biggest thing that you could possibly have, a reputation for having an ear, a golden ear. I had a golden ear. And I don't have it anymore. I am so woefully out of it. But I had a golden ear in those days. So it was a combination of common sense. It was a combination of looking at the sales charts. It was a combination of seeing what other experts who were on the front line in AOR were playing. And you come to a consensus. And it's
you had a tremendous amount of influence. You would curate this list, and I'm assuming that a lot of stations, based on your reputation and your golden ear, would then take this list and put it on the air the following week. Am I correct in assuming that?
I used to say one man's gut is another man's research.
And by the way, I do not entirely disagree with you. I believe I go back to, I think Steve Jobs said this about Henry Ford, but Henry Ford had said, if I had asked the people what they had wanted, they would have told me a faster horse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or they would try to put wheels on horses instead of horseshoes.
Right.
I mean, that's a brilliant line. And it's true. So I was battling all kinds of artistic political battles in terms of the relationship between radio stations and record companies as to what is the most potent unit of measurement. Is it the single, the 45 RPM single, or is it top tracks? And that, Chachi, is the genesis of FM rock radio making top 40 radio less potent in terms of research and ratings.
Absolutely fascinating. When you sell Good Phone, I just want to go back to the entrepreneurial spirit. Was that hard for you to sell it to Billboard?
No,
it was your baby.
They got a great deal. I'm not at liberty to go in.
No, I don't totally understand. But was that tough for you to do?
I had a conversation with the late Lee Zito, who was at that time the publisher of Billboard. He operated out of the Billboard offices in Beverly Hills, I believe, or certainly near Beverly Hills on Wilshire Boulevard, big building. And he and I ran into each other. I don't remember how that happened. He was a very cool character with a big handlebar mustache, the publisher of Billboard magazine. Very intimidating.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And he liked me. He thought that I could be of help to them. So he said, look, what are you wasting your time with this, this cockamamie tip sheet? Let's bring what you do into Billboard. And I'm still feeling, oh my gosh, how can I work with Billboard? When I was at R&R and we built ourselves up as being the unbillboard, the trade that's run by radio, not by records. Billboard was dominated by record influence. We were dominated by radio orientation. Everything's political. And I said, but okay, yeah, what the hell? And Good Phone was gone. I still owned Good Phone Communications. Good Phone Weekly was gone. They dismantled it immediately. And they used to have the Good Phone commentaries in Billboard. They used the name and they put the top tracks in. And the rest is history.
What an amazing accomplishment. I'm going to guess, I'm just trying to do the monkey math on this, but you're probably 40 by this point, around there. At this point, you have done mornings in New York on NEW. You've invented the AOR format, launched it at KPRI in San Diego. You've worked for R&R as the AOR editor. You've had 4 or 5 successful syndicated shows. You did a night show that was all talk on KMET. You're the programmer, the consultant. You've sold your company to Billboard, and you're 40 at this time.
I was in my mid-30s.
Holy shit. You're in your mid 30s and you've done more than probably most people do throughout their entire career. That's unbelievable.
It's embarrassing.
That is,
I can't keep a job.
and well, it's an incredible body of work. Well, and a lot of these were going on simultaneously too. You had 3 or 4 jobs.
Simultaneous. That's the part that makes it difficult. When you asked me, to just for a little bit of background, what was the chronology of my career? I had a lot of trouble with that because I had multiple careers going on. I still do. I still, I've never stopped doing that. And at this point, maybe I'm too old to be doing this kind of stuff. There is a point at which, your age precedes you. And, I'm at that point now where I got to do some real thinking about it. But at this moment that we're doing this conversation, I still am doing about 2 or 3 careers simultaneously. I
think it's terrific. I kind of broke this down into 3 segments, right? So I went from New York, Southern California as your second segment, and now we're going to go into the third chapter here, let's call it. You now decide to go back to the East Coast, to go to Springfield, Massachusetts, and you become a station owner and a morning show talk host. So now you've made that full transition from being in the AOR rock world into talk radio.
Not completely, because one of the ways I was able to finance that was I was doing a show for CBS Radio called Rock Connections with Mike Harrison. And that overlapped the end of my LA days and the beginning of my Springfield days.
Okay.
And that was a pretty cool show, and it was a top track show for AOR stations. So it wasn't that I just cut it off and then I started doing it again. And I subsequently, a couple of years later, wound up doing the official history of rock and roll for Mel Karmazin, who then sold that to ABC Radio Network. But I was obsessed with talk radio as far back as 1974, 75. And that's what led me to do Harrison's Mic on KMET. That's what I wanted to do when I grew up. I wanted to be a talk show host, and I was obsessed with talk radio. And make a long story short, I was under the impression that the 90s were going to be the big breakout year for talk radio, for the talk format. And I wanted to get in on it in 2 ways. One, I wanted to own a station and maybe a chain of stations that did talk in the modern way, not the old-fashioned way, but really high-energy research topics, charts of topics. The same thing, I did the same thing, found a really, really wonderful partner who was a well-known broadcaster to help me find a station, and we would do it together. He was older than me, more seasoned as to sales and management. His name, Al Herskovitz, who is a kind of a legendary figure in LA radio and around the country. So the two of us spent a year looking for that first radio station that we could buy, that we could put this format I developed called Super Talk, not to be confused with other Super Talks that have come since then. This was the first Super Talk. And we found WSPR in Springfield, Massachusetts, 1270 on the dial, standalone AM. And we went and we bought it and installed the Super Talk format in it. And then I was a full-time owner, morning host in Springfield, Massachusetts, after doing radio in San Diego, Los Angeles, and New York. This was a small market radio, whole new experience, and really tweaking the nuts and bolts of what I saw as the future of talk radio. Sold the station. We bought it in 1986. We sold it for twice the money in 1988. For the first time in my life, I had nothing going. The next day, the phone rings. I get a call from Infinity Broadcasting. Would I like to produce, do I have time to produce a 48-hour special for them on rock and roll history? Because I had a reputation for doing pretty good specials. And I said, just so happens I've got the time. And I spent 1989 producing that show. And then when it was done, it went into syndication. And in 1990, Dan Mason hired me at Cook Inlet Broadcasting's WZLX in Boston. I was still in San Diego, in Springfield. I never left. I liked it there. And I spent about a year as PD of WZLX in Boston, updating their classic rock format and library to be more competitive as the 90s were about to come. That ended, and I started Talkers in 1990 to take advantage of the coming talk radio phenomenon that I thought was coming, and I was right. It did.
Yeah, you were spot on. So the catalyst, you now had the experience. You'd done mornings, you'd programmed, you'd consulted, you owned a radio station, and obviously wrote for Billboard and R&R. So now you've got and the entrepreneurial experience that you had. It all kind of culminated with Talkers.
Yeah, I put everything I had into this creation called Talkers. It was a little bit of R&R, it was a little bit of Billboard, it was a little bit of a tip sheet, it was in a newspaper format. And, over 34 years this summer that I'm publishing Talkers.
That's incredible.
It's gone through changes. At one point it was a newspaper, then it became a color magazine, and then it became online only. And, and now it's got all kinds of digital arms to it, and there's no print whatsoever. And, we're about to do our 26th annual convention. So,
congratulations. That's amazing.
It's evolved. It's evolved as has the industry. Hey, radio industry is never easy. And these are tough days in radio. And right now, I think the major issue is, for years, the major issue at Talkers was helping, talk radio and radio, evolve into the digital era. Now it's, existential. It's can radio survive the enormous technological and sociological changes that are happening? And my feeling is maybe it can survive.
Do you feel, I don't think it's a distribution challenge as much as it's a content challenge, in that we don't invest as an industry like we should in developing great content. Radio is so easily accessible compared to the streaming, or I should say, let's just talk about the streaming companies. It takes some work to download an app, to sign up for an account, to put your credit card information in, to seek content out. I think that we absolutely have the most easily accessed distribution that you could find, but we've unfortunately cut back on the investment in content when the streaming companies are investing very heavily in content.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I couldn't say it any better than you just did. And one of the leading excuses for this dereliction of duty and squandering of opportunity is that radio is in debt and can't afford to do the type of research and development that it takes to have a viable medium compete in a changing world. I say, radio can no longer afford to do radio. And I find that to be a shame. It saddens me. I'm kind of a sentimental slob in terms of personal relationships, but I'm not a sentimental slob when it comes to believing that anything of the past is written in stone and is for all time. Culture is what you grew up with, and what's going on today, I guess, is going to be as big a deal to today's kids when they're older as my looking back at stuff. There was once a time when people bemoaned the fall of vaudeville. How could there be show business without vaudeville? Right. So I'm not going to get into a whole thing that radio was better in the old days and all that. But I'm sad to see that the potential that radio could have to turn it around right now in the noisy world cluttered with the democratized internet, they're not doing it. It's like Broadway saying, well, we don't have to be the best theater in the world. We're Broadway. If you're going to go to Broadway and you're going to pay $1,000 for a ticket, it better be better than the community theater back in Peoria.
Sure.
And if you're going to go see a Major League Baseball game, I don't care how many sandlots there are or little league teams there are. You want to see Major League Baseball and you're going to pay money to see it. Well, the answer to the podcast question with radio is make the best damn audio entertainment and information in the world and put it on the radio like Broadway is on Broadway and the New York Yankees play at Yankee Stadium, and you'll have successful medium, but they don't think that way. And all the people running around going, what are we going to do about podcasting and all that? And the most that the podcast researchers can say is, do you believe there are now 500,000 podcasts out there? Ooh, what does that information mean? Suppose that we were in the publishing business, in the book publishing business, and somebody says, do you know how many people own typewriters? You know?
No, that is so well put. I'd be remiss not to mention, obviously you've got Talkers and the convention, but you also have got a talk radio countdown show that you started in 91 that is a 2-hour weekend talk show, and it's heard on over 300 stations. That's incredible as well.
I started that. I can't resist doing a countdown. If I was doing countdowns, I may as well do a topic countdown. So I started the Talk Radio Countdown Show. Didn't have enough time after a few years to devote myself to it the way I did. So my colleague, very well-known talk broadcaster, also independent, syndicated, Doug Steffen, took over the production, distribution, and hosting of the show. But I sit in the co-pilot seat with him and I'm the color caller to this day. So I've been on the air every week with that show since around 1991 or 92. And I recently pulled the plug on a 3.5-year project called the Michael Harrison Rap, which was started with a countdown, the first 7 minutes, and then was a 1-hour overview. It was on over 100 radio stations and was very successful. I just had to stop because I was exhausted at the end of the week. And, that's why I'm saying I'm at the point now where I have to really, watch myself. Because I'm getting older and, you can't work day and night.
Yeah, your career is so incredibly impressive. The body of work, your creations, I mean, it's just really awe-inspiring. And I also want to mention that you, in your spare time, and I'm glad you've got a little more spare time to enjoy yourself, I think radio to you is much like me. I think it's certainly your work, but I'm sure you derive a great deal of enjoyment from it. So it's a hobby to a degree as well. But
lifelong love affair with radio.
Yeah. Your other love is you are also in a band, the Gun Hill Road Rock Band. You just released a brand new single and your 5th album. You co-wrote, you performed the lead vocals. The title of the song is Idiots. I'll make sure that we include a link to the music video and a link to Talkers in the show notes. But tell me a little bit about your band.
Well, it's not my band. I'm honored to be in it. I can't believe I'm in it. Gun Hill Road's been around since the late 60s. They're named after an iconic street in the Bronx. It has nothing to do with guns. Sometimes I say I'm in Gun Hill Road. Oh, you're one of those right-wing, no. Gun Hill Road is a place in the Bronx. And when I was on WNEW-FM, they had 2 albums out, one on Mercury, one on Kama Sutra. And I loved them. And they had a song called 42nd Street, which was about New York City. I played it because I could play whatever I wanted. I played them every day. Every day. I was the guy championing Gun Hill Road. And that's how I got to know them. They had a mid-charting hit single in 73 called Back When My Hair Was Short, which still gets played, I think, on Sirius's 70s and 7. And people know Gun Hill Road, and so they got back together about 8 years ago with their 3rd album called Every 40 Years, called me up immediately to tell me they were doing it. I championed them in every possible way I could, introduced them at their reunion concert at the bitter end in the Village, which for me was like, I can't believe I'm going to be getting on the stage at the bitter end. I haven't been there in 50 years, 45 years. And they invited me to join the band for their 4th album.
Awesome.
I wrote a song called I Know You're Real, which is about my interest in animal welfare. And it's kind of a cosmic tune. And I don't sing, I talk. And then we came up with Idiots for the 5th album, which is coming out this summer, as an advanced track. And it's kind of an internet hit. We got tens of thousands of downloads on it. And it's basically, and I talk it, but I talk it a little bit more, bouncy. Musically, it's killer. I mean, these guys are great. Steve Goldrich, Paul Reich, Brian Coonan, and Michael Harrison. That is the 4-man lineup of Gun Hill Road. And, Idiots is a song that I co-wrote with them, both the music and the words, to basically express my feeling that widespread idiocy is the greatest threat to American democracy that we have going. And I've gotten so much play and so much attention on talk radio, no airplay on music radio. But so much play on talk radio and so many interviews that we're in the tens of thousands on YouTube.
Oh, that's great.
In terms of the song. So anybody listening to this, go to idiotsvideo.com and check out the video we made, which is a lot of fun.
And we'll make sure to put a link in the show notes. Michael, this has been so incredibly enjoyable. One question before I let you go. I'm wondering, of all the different positions you've held and companies you've owned, if you could go back and pick one highlight that was your favorite, which one would have been?
I would say doing Harrison's mic on KMET between 1975 and 1986 was the most magical. And I was still naive enough to find it to be a great adventure, but I was smart enough to do it with great care and appreciation. One of the things that I talk about with a lot of my colleagues from the old days is, weren't we lucky to be in radio during those days? Nothing against radio today, but those were really great days to be in radio.
Man, absolutely awesome. Michael, thank you. Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. Please make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This has been a Benztown McVeigh podcast production. Hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis. Executive producer, Darren Silva. Producer and editor, Jake Urbanik. Show coordinator, Estefania Padilla. Marketing and distribution, Suzanne Aksu and Robbie Gessel.